Okay, good afternoon again, everyone. My name is Steve Flax, and I'm pinch hitting for Rachel Gotzel, the chair. And this is the second tranche of sort of testimonies today. Earlier today, we had the apartment tenants' testimony, so I want to welcome the apartment owners. And at this point, what I'll do, just in terms of being most expedient, I'll introduce each one of you, and then I'll pass the baton on to Jack, who will make some opening comments, and then Jack can introduce each of the testimonies. So today we have Mary Ann Rothman, Executive Director of the New York Council of Cooperatives and Condominiums. Welcome, Mary Ann. Ali Ruth Davis, Vice President, Management Services and Government Affairs for the Real Estate Board of New York. Welcome. Patrick Siconolfi, I apologize. Executive Director for CHIP, Community Housing Improvement Program. Jimmy Silber, Small Property Owners of New York, SPONY. And lastly, as I just mentioned, Jack Freund, Executive VP of the Rent Stabilization Association today. Jack, take it away.
Thank you, Steve. Is this on here?
I don't think so. Now it's on, yeah.
No, that was mine.
Yeah, it is. Now it is. Oh, that's interesting. Now it's more on. Oh, yeah.
That's what we want, more on.
All right, good. So I'm going to turn it over to Mary Ann to begin with, but let me just tell you a story because it just happened yesterday and there's a moral to it. I don't usually moralize, but in this case, we have a monthly RSA membership meeting. We had one yesterday. They're small. We do it in our boardroom. About 50, 60 owners come in each month to get updates. So in advance of this meeting, Steve Banks, who you may know is the New York City Commissioner for the Human Resources Administration, appointed by Bill de Blasio, as Steve likes to say, on April Fool's Day, to his chagrin. So he asked to have some time before our memberships because he was rolling out a new program. And as you may know, HRA has in the last few months rolled out a number of rent supplement programs. He said he had a new one that he wanted to run by our membership. We didn't ask him what it was. We have a history with Steve that goes back a ways. As you know, they just did announce this program yesterday. This administration seems to like to spring things on people without really much advance notice or input, as is their manner. So since we do go back with Steve Banks was, prior to being commissioner of HRA, was head of the Legal Aid Society, which is a group that represents tenants in housing court, and you would think that that would be an adversarial relationship between us and Steve and the Legal Aid Society, but in fact, we on a number of occasions teamed up with Steve, and specifically on one occasion when Mayor Bloomberg did rescind the Advantage program, which was a rent supplement program at that time. We joined with the Legal Aid Society and Steve in a lawsuit to try to maintain that program, which was providing benefits to tenants and owners. And I think that's the moral that I want to bring to this table today. This is, often characterized as an adversarial relationship. I don't think it really is. Steve came to us looking for owners to rent. He needs apartments for the populations that he's targeting. Our members, our owners, need tenants. This is a symbiotic relationship. And it really, in most places in the world, in the country and the world, is not an adversarial relationship as it is here. So we come to you in that spirit. I mean, you're going to hear very divergent things from owners and tenants, and this will maybe be the last conciliatory comment I make. But nevertheless, I want to start out on that foot that owners need tenants, tenants need owners. We all want decent housing, we all want more housing, we all want more affordable housing, and we need to figure out, or you need to figure out, how to draw that line down the middle that will accomplish those goals. And as we discussed today, I think we'll suggest to you where that line is, and we hope you make the correct ultimate decision. So thank you, and let me turn to Mary Ann.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Let me echo what Jack is saying. We're one city, and all of the elements of the city have to... Did I turn it off? Yeah.
Yes. Good afternoon again. And I agree with Jack that we're one city where all of the elements of the city have to work together to make it the best place it can be. My organization, the Council of New York Cooperatives and Condominiums, is a membership organization of more than 2,300 housing cooperatives and condominiums located throughout the 5 boroughs of New York City and beyond. They're the homes of more than 175,000 New York families. For over 35 years, CNYC, that's my organization, has provided education, information, and advocacy to our members and has tried to bring their needs to the attention of lawmakers and government agencies. Many of our members are converted from rental housing to cooperative or condominium status. Since 1982, rent-regulated tenants who opt not to purchase their units have generally had the right to stay on in their apartments. And even prior to that time, senior citizens and individuals with disabilities could exempt themselves from the conversion process and stay on as renters in the converting buildings. As a result, many CNYC member cooperatives and condominiums have rent-regulated tenants. In some cases, the rent-regulated apartments are now owned by the cooperative or condominium, often as a result of the default by the sponsor, the original sponsor. In these instances, the rent which the cooperative or condominium collects from these tenants is very often considerably less than the cost of actually operating the unit. When this happens, the budget of the co-op or condo must cover the shortfall. If it's the former sponsor or an investor who owns the rent-regulated unit with a shortfall, that owner is still responsible for paying the full carrying charges for the unit, and as a result, there's always a risk of default by the owners of those units. Co-ops and condos are self-contained communities governed by volunteer boards elected by shareholders or by the shareholders or unit owners. The board is responsible for the operation of the co-op or condo, which it tries to do in a way that provides quality housing at a reasonable cost. After all, the board members live there too. Prudent cooperatives and condominiums will also try to set a budget that funds reserves to cover the cost of repairs and replacement of building systems. Beyond that, co-ops and condos operate at break-even. There's no reason for them to seek to make any sort of profit. For these reasons, I feel that the operating costs of cooperatives and condominiums in New York City give good insights into the actual costs of operating similar rental properties. Every year, the Council of New York Cooperatives and Condominiums compiles a study of operating costs in co-ops and condos. We collect financial data on as many co-ops and condos as are willing to share their annual financial statements with us, and we compare on a dollars per room per year basis the various costs of operating these buildings. Because we work from the annual financial statements, there's always a lag in our statistics. Co-ops and condos typically receive these statements from their accountants in spring and early summer. Once we receive the data and work it into our annual study, it's autumn before the prior year's study is published. Therefore, I've had distributed to you today copies of the comparative study of 2013 operating costs. I hope you will find it of interest. It presents data on more than 1,100 co-ops and condos divided into 8 sets of charts, presenting raw data for the participating buildings on the basis of dollars per room spent in each of 10 to 14 categories. Following that presentation is a 10-year review of the data for most categories. Now, unfortunately, it's not exactly the same 1,100 buildings every year, so the statistics are not perfect. However, our categories are now sufficiently large that I think that it's statistically significant. Let me point out that the summaries of maintenance charges from 2004 to 2013 reflect operating cost increases that significantly exceed the total amount of Rent Guideline Board rent increases approved for that time span. During this 10-year period, which roughly covers RGB apartment orders 35 to 44, the total percentage of rent increases allowed was 33.5% for one-year leases. By comparison, co-ops on the west side of Manhattan, pages 22 to 23, averaged a 56% increase in maintenance costs over that period of time, and those on the east side of Manhattan averaged a 47% increase. Small co-ops in Brooklyn averaged a 44% increase in maintenance costs over the 10 years. If the average rent for a 3.5-room apartment in 2013 Manhattan was $1,182 or $338 per room to conform with our standard. This is considerably lower than the average monthly maintenance of $412 per room in cooperatives on the west side of Manhattan or $515 per room in east side cooperatives. It's also important to note that real estate taxes in these areas exceed the 26% used by the Rent Guidelines Board when calculating the price index of operating costs. For example, real estate taxes were 41% of a typical budget for cooperatives on the east side of Manhattan, 39% for those on the west side, and 30.5% for small co-ops in Brooklyn in 2013. CNYC urges the Rent Guidelines Board to allow rent increases attuned to the cost of operating property in New York City today. Rents should cover the costs of operating a unit, plus allow a margin of profit for the owner of the property. In the case of cooperatives and condominiums owning rent-regulated units, growing shortfalls between rent collected and actual costs impose a hardship on all the other residents of the building. Thank you for this opportunity to comment.
Thank you very much. Any committee members have any questions? Yes, Helen.
So do you have any statistics about the number of rent-regulated units or in cooperatives?
That I don't. We could make an effort to get that, but it's, we are still 70% a city of renters, so that an awful lot of the units in co-ops converted in the last 30 or 40 years are rental units.
Okay, thank you.
Harvey?
I just have one
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Do the other board members understand the non-eviction condo co-op plan? People, okay.
Thank you. Harvey?
So I have a couple of questions if I can. And thank you. You represent me since I live in a co-op in Manhattan, so I guess this is... So I'm wondering about the co-ops outside of Manhattan and the condo. You said some small buildings in Brooklyn. I didn't hear anything about the Bronx or Queens.
Okay, there's a chart in your book called Larger Cooperatives Outside of Manhattan.
So when you say larger,
more
is
than
it page
100?
46 and 47, right?
Everything we do is based on rooms, so larger means more than 100 rooms.
So these are buildings that you said more than 100 units?
Rooms.
100 rooms. So
look at the left. First there's a code number, then there's the number of rooms, and then there's the number of units, because there are some buildings full of studios and then there's some buildings full of huge apartments. They may have the same number of rooms in those two, but the number of units is
So what percentage of your 1,100 buildings are outside of Manhattan?
35%.
35%. So 65% are in Manhattan and 35%.
It's 60-40 at this point.
60-40. And because it's the study on page 46 and 47 says, there are no statistics on the bottom, says 7 units and 5 units. So those are saying in this study for 2004 to 2013, those are the number of buildings you're studying outside of Manhattan? Is that what the footnote means on 46 and 47?
Yes.
Okay. So of this study,
That's actually the number, those are the buildings who shared their financial
Right, I just-
statements
yeah,
with
so-
us. I
so-
spend a lot of time chasing
so,
information.
no, I'm sure my building didn't share it either, so I'm...
We'll talk.
So I just want to make sure I'm clear that, so this data from 2004 to 2013, buildings outside of Manhattan and the small buildings in Brooklyn, we're talking about between 4 and 11 buildings is this study sample.
I'm completely confused. What page are you on?
Page 5.
Page 46 and 47.
Page 5 answered your question about
The definition.
the statistical set.
It's the definitions, locations.
The statistical set has 137 buildings
Outside of Manhattan?
outside of Manhattan that have
And in-
100 or more.
Rooms.
And in 2004, there were 111.
But then on page 46 and 47, she's talking about for this data, this is the assessment between 4 and 7 buildings.
Say it, where are you
This is
getting
the aggregate versus,
But that 7
Those are
co-ops
subsets.
reported their heat and fuel, their fuel and utilities together. There were 137 this year, and if you look down,
so it says these data, these are the numbers,
look at the
137,
numbers.
123.
You're looking at the footnotes. I couldn't find it at first.
Okay,
I'm sorry.
so the co-ops is the number on the side next to the
Correct.
year. Those are the number of buildings that are reported? Mm-hmm. Great, that was really helpful. And you said you don't know how many units where the co-op actually owns a rent-stabilized unit? You don't know what those numbers are either?
Well, it would be fairly hard to find that statistic, but, there's a very substantial number of rent-regulated apartments in co-ops and condos throughout the city, because the conversion process allows for the concept of...
Yeah, so we're not a big one, but do you know how many units in this 1,100 number, how many units are you talking about in that number of buildings?
We haven't asked, so we don't know.
And so we don't know how many units this universe is, and you don't know how many within that universe is
What
rent-stabilized.
we're looking to show in the study is what the operating costs of co-ops and condos in the city. Now, whether the unit has a rent-regulated tenant or an open market tenant or a shareholder in it, the cost of operating that individual unit from the point of view of the co-op is the same. You can see across this chart, what we're looking at labor and repairs and maintenance and heat and debt service and things like that in co-ops and condos. No, we've never tried to garner statistics on exactly who owns the units that are not.
Or in my building where people buy the units where the maintenance is lower than the rent-stabilized rent. So there are some of those, and there are some units where the maintenance is higher
Correct.
than the rent-stabilized rent. We don't have the data to say which way or the other. Okay, thank you.
I think if I could just add to that discussion, I'm glad, Harvey, that you live in a co-op, because you probably know how much your co-op maintenance charges have increased over the years, and probably safe to guess that they've increased at more than the rate of increase that this board has granted for rent-stabilized apartments, which I think is the point of Mary Ann's testimony. Let me also just stress that this is not meant to be, Mary Ann, an exhaustive study of all co-ops. It is a sample, in much the same way the income and expense data reviewed by this board is also just a sample and is not an exhaustive study. So let me now turn to the testimony of Ali Davis from REBNY.
Good afternoon, members of the Rent Guidelines Board. The Real Estate Board of New York, representing over 16,000 owners, developers, managers, and brokers of real property in New York City, thanks you for the opportunity to provide testimony regarding this year's rent adjustments. After last year's historically low rate increase, we strongly urge the Rent Guidelines Board to set reasonable and fair rent increases that reflect the continually increasing costs faced by New York City's property owners. A failure to do so will not only impact existing buildings, but it may have serious long-term effects on the production of new affordable housing in the city. Although the Rent Guideline Board's 2015 Price Index of Operating Costs is PIOC, the way people typically pronounce it, only shows an overall increase of 0.5% in operating costs this year, we believe that this figure greatly understates the actual costs incurred by property owners. When one takes into account how buildings contract to purchase their fuel and the heavy and continually increasing tax burden on rental properties, we believe that the true cost of operating a multifamily rental building has risen more in the past year than the PIOC would suggest. The major factor in this year's low increase in the PIOC is the 21% decrease in fuel costs shown in the report. Prices for fuel oil and natural gas have been volatile in recent years, ultimately trending down this year. When one looks at long-term trends over the last decade, however, the cost of fuel oil, which accounts for approximately 70% of the index's fuel component, has risen at a rate of 5.9% above the general rate of inflation. Since most property owners have multi-year oil and gas contracts, overall trends in the price of fuel are much more reflective of their actual costs. Only those owners whose contracts happen to be up for renewal at times when prices fall are able to benefit from temporary plunges in the market. Most owners remain locked into existing contracts entered into when prices were higher. All other factors in the PIOC, including labor, maintenance, and administrative costs, rose this year, with the core PIOC, excluding heating costs, rising by 3.6%. The largest percent rise in cost in this year's PIOC was for insurance, with an increase of 7.2%. This was the fourth consecutive annual increase in insurance costs, which once again is likely the result of events outside of traditional market forces. These include the lingering effects of Superstorm Sandy and the late renewal of the Terrorism Risk Insurance Act, or TRIA, which led to market uncertainty and increases in insurance costs. Property taxes are the single largest expense for most residential buildings. The 2015 PIOC weights taxes at 26% of the overall index, a reduction from the PIOC's prior weight of 28.5%, and REBNY's own estimates show that taxes represent an even higher percentage of costs. And this year's figure shows an increase of nearly 4.2% in property taxes. The tax burden on rental properties is disproportionately high and continues to grow due to inequities in the property tax system that, due to the comprehensive and extensive nature of the necessary reforms, is unlikely to change anytime soon. Class 2 properties, co-ops, condos, and rentals, including rent-regulated apartments, represent 23.6% of the market value of taxable real estate in New York City, but they pay a disproportionate 37% of the city's real property taxes. Within Class 2 properties, residential rental buildings, including rent-regulated units, pay an unequal share of Class 2's levy because of how the city is required by law to value properties. According to a 2006 study by the New York City Independent Budget Office, elevator rental buildings pay an effective tax of $3.72 for every $100 of market value, compared with 62 cents for every $100 of market value paid by co-ops and condos. With the skyrocketing sales prices for co-ops and condos, this disparity can only have increased since the study was completed. As a result of these inequities in the real property tax system, residential rental buildings are paying a disproportionate share of both the city's overall tax levy as well as Class 2's tax levy. These rates are fixed by the city, and owners rely on reasonable rent increases to help offset their continually growing tax burdens. Finally, setting too low of a rent adjustment could have negative long-term impacts on affordable housing production in the city and may imperil Mayor de Blasio's ambitious goal of building 80,000 new units of affordable housing over the next decade. Low rent increases are particularly disastrous for new rental construction, which isn't financially feasible without the use of tax exemption programs that require all units, including market rate units, to be subject to rent regulations. With multiple years of low rent increases, expenses will outpace revenues, and projects will have difficulty covering their debt service. A pattern of low increases may also prevent proposed projects from moving forward entirely. If the Rent Guidelines Board follows last year's historically low increase with another similarly low increase, or even worse, a freeze or a negative rent adjustment, it will be increasingly difficult for developers to attract the lenders and investors necessary to finance these projects. Developers will be unable to move forward with new affordable projects, or they may decide to build fully market-rate co-op or condominium projects instead. For all of these reasons, we need fair increases that balance out the costs actually incurred by owners. After last year's 1% increase, another very low increase or negative adjustment would have serious negative impacts on landlords with stabilized units and might tip the scales against a project for developers considering building much needed new affordable housing. The maintenance of our aging housing stock requires rent increases that cover increased operating costs, and these rational increases would benefit owners and managers, tenants, and the city as a whole. Thank you very much for allowing me the opportunity to provide this testimony.
Thank you very much. Any questions? Harvey.
Thank you for testifying. I have a question. Do you feel like there should be a differentiation between those buildings that have 100% affordable housing in them or 100% rent-stabilized housing versus buildings that, there's only 2 stabilized units left in a 20-unit building? Should the rent increases be different because the economic situation is different for each of those buildings?
I'm not sure I follow, but...
Yeah, so if all your units are stabilized, our increases affect all your units. If through whatever happens in a building, you have a 20-unit building, but 15 have come out of stabilization because they've exceeded the $2,500 cap of rent stabilization, do you feel like the economics in that building might be different versus a building that's fully rent stabilized?
You won't know. I mean, let me just respond to that, if I may. The industry, all of us sitting here, have always stood in opposition to the notion of slicing and dicing the cake too finely, or at all. This board has always passed an across-the-board rent increase. Now, that doesn't make much sense, because we know that there's a huge diversity. Some buildings make money, some buildings don't make money, clearly. And you come up with some average, and we'll talk about that a little more. Pat will talk about that more clearly. But it would be exceedingly, you cannot, let me put it this way, you can't make those distinctions. You don't have enough data to be able to determine what the real economics of a building is, whether they are making money or whether they're not making money. The role of this board is to look at the overall increase in costs and to pass an adjustment that does rough justice to that increase in costs. And that's it. That is the role of the board. We'll talk about more as we go along.
I just want to say something. That hasn't historically been the role of the board. We've said if you're, in the past, we've had your rent below $500, $750, there's an additional increase that you have to pay, assuming that there's a differential for owners. So my question is that owners, whether it's different incomes that tenants are paying, or some units are unstabilized and some units are stabilized, should we be looking at those buildings differently? Because historically we've looked at units that are different based on the building, the complement of the building.
Yeah. Mary Ann makes a good point, but let me before I let Mary Ann make her point, let me just respond, Harvey, that in the past when we've had lower rent adjustments, for instance, those have also applied across the board. It was every rent less than 300, then less than 500, then less than 600. So every measure that this board has done has really been an across-the-board measure, and let me just ask Mary Ann to respond.
If I've correctly understood your question about disparate rents in a building, property taxes are based on income and expense forms, so the taxes levied on that mixed building are going to be higher than those levied on the all rent-regulated building. So the city finds ways to strike a balance other than through
Let me just go back and emphasize a couple of points that Ali made, which I think are very significant here. And the first had to do with, she mentioned oil contracts. Now, I can tell you, we've discussed this in before, in prior years, owners usually enter into some kind of deal where they lock in prices or fix their prices over a period of time. I can tell you from personal experience that I made the mistake on my personal home of locking in an oil price for this year. And as a result, I'm still paying an oil rate that's 50% higher than what I would have paid had I been smart enough. But you never know about that, you know? So that's what we're talking about here. Even though there was a drop in oil, many owners just are not benefiting that. And the type of owner that Ali is talking about does multi-year contracts, whereas our typical smaller owner may only have a one-year seasonal contract. The other thing is, important point is real estate taxes, where REBNY has done a lot, and Ali has pointed out that on a proportionate basis, rental properties pay more in real estate taxes than co-ops and condos. And Mary Ann has pointed out that co-ops and condos pay more than this board is estimating that they do. So, you know, we have long argued for several years that the way this board measures real estate in the aggregate is wrong, and that should be calculated on a per building basis, and I think we get a different result, a more accurate result if we do that. And we are going to reinstitute our request to the RGB staff this year to recalculate the real estate component of the price index in a more realistic way, which we think will result in a weight that's higher and more appropriate. Thank you, and let me turn to Pat.
Sorry, I just had one question before.
Yeah.
So can you just explain what you mean by on a per building basis? I'm not sure I understand the difference.
Well, right now, taxes are, the way the real, and Andrew will correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sure, but taxes are calculated in the aggregate. You take all the real estate tax assessments. I'm not sure of the methodology, but basically you're taking all the assessments, multiplying it by the tax rate, and then deducting all the tax exemption and abatements, as if those tax exemption and abatements were spread uniformly throughout the rent-stabilized universe. Well, they're not. You know, we know they're concentrated in a few buildings, relatively few buildings. So our contention is that if you actually took the real estate tax bill increase year to year for each individual building, which is certainly possible to do with the data and I spoke to Dr. Hudson about this again, and he confirms that it can be done. So if there is a will, it will be done. And I think what happens when you do that on a building basis, you get a different rate of increase because it reflects the actual rate of increase for each building as opposed to having some huge factor. I mean, 421A is like $1 billion in tax exemptions that are then spread over the entire universe of rent-stabilized buildings, even though they don't benefit from them. So this is, you know, a matter that we will continue to pursue.
I mean, doesn't the income and expense survey, people report real estate taxes, correct?
Yeah, they report real estate, but the I&E is done on a unit basis. So we take a look at the per unit, not per building.
In PIAC,
Right.
PIAC is...
The PIAC, we have the building, but what we do with the PIAC is we take an aggregate of bills for all the buildings from 1 year, and then all the buildings for the second year, and see what the percent change is. Right, so I think in theory, you could take all, you know, if you have the building, and you could go and figure out what the change is for each individual building, and do it that way, and get a median increase on. I think that's what you're talking about.
That's precisely what we're talking about, Andrew. You characterized it correctly.
Right, and, you know,
I think that would actually change two things, actually, not just the rate of increase might be different, but it also might change the weighting as well.
Well, the weighting's coming from the I&E, so that wouldn't, but if we have the tax bill, I mean, if you do the median increase like that, I'd have to double check with Jim, and he ran something, and I'm not sure exactly.
But the I&E uses it on a per unit basis, though,
Right.
correct? Rather than a building-wide basis. So then that would actually be...
I mean, isn't a building-wide basis divided by units?
Yeah, I mean, it's the units that are in the building. I'm not,
It's reflective of a building-by-building situation, right? Even if you end up with a per unit number, no?
Well, that makes a mistake in the other direction. You know, you're going, on one hand, you're going to the aggregate, and on the other, you're going to a hypothetical per unit. Owners don't operate units, and they don't have aggregate taxes. They operate buildings, and, you know, that's what their expenses are based on, that's what their income is based on, and that's what I believe the increase in things like real estate taxes should be based on. It should be the average increase per building.
But I have to say, that's why the income and expense data is, as it is right now, is the most accurate data, because you could have an increase in real estate taxes, and that could just be passed along to some percentage to a commercial tenant in the building, and that'll be in the income and expense data, because the income and the expense will be there to, so the idea of separating that information, the real estate taxes in and of itself isn't the marker, it's the change in cost to the owner, which is why NOI is important as an information source, because it tells us how owners are doing over a period of time. That's why income and expense is important together.
But income and expense changed at a different rate. The expenses changed at a different rate than the PIAC this year. And so, so I agree with you. I think the income and expense is a much better, there's no proxy, there's no price calculation, it's actual increase in cost. That's real data, but that's not 0.5% growth. That was more significant.
But that's what we're saying. We use the price index as well as income and expense data, net operating income, tenants' income and expenses, and we smush it all together to figure out what we think is an appropriate increase or decrease based on the data.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Thanks. We'll turn to Pat.
Thank you for the opportunity to present. I'm the Executive Director of the Community Housing Improvement Program, or CHIP. CHIP represents approximately 4,000 owners of multifamily housing in the city, and those members of ours own about 400,000 units of housing. And, you know, it's interesting because collectively our members provide more affordable housing to the people of this city than NYCHA, than City Mitchell-Lama, than State Mitchell-Lama, or than even the mayor's new housing plan, even when if it were to be fully realized. So it's a significant portion of the housing stock. And CHIP, I want to echo something that Jack said. CHIP describes itself as housing advocates. And in fact, we may be the original housing advocates in the city, given our age. And it's our feeling that if public policy does what's necessary and good for housing, that will then inure to the benefit of owners and tenants. So that's the way we approach this. Having said that, I want to go into some of what I think are some of the analytical issues with the data that's being presented by the RGB. There's what I think of as an arbitrary analysis in some of the reports, which distort how owner and tenant circumstances are presented. And there are three characteristics that I'd like to bring to your attention. The income and expense analysis is, we believe, in error. The RGB relies on income and expense reports to demonstrate the general financial health of the industry. Several measures of financial performance are available in the canon of accounting, but the RGB has chosen a somewhat misleading one. The RGB's analyses of building finances recognize rental revenue from capital projects, things like MCIs and IAIs, but they fail to recognize the capital expense. This creates a misstatement of the building's finances. Revenues are overstated and expenses are understated. Either capital items are fully recognized for both cost and revenue, or they are not recognized as to either. And, we can go into specifics in the I&E. On page 4, you'll see the average rent per apartment at $11.82, and that includes capital revenue, but the average expense for apartment 2 pages later at $8.84 does not include the expense from the same items. So I would say that NOI is the wrong indicator. The RGB asserts that, and this is a quote, NOI is a good indicator of a building's basic financial condition. It is not. NOI is a thumbnail sketch by itself, and it's always by itself in these reports. It's insufficient to form a conclusion. If the goal is to understand the buildings and the industry's financial performance, then another measure is needed, and what is appropriate here is NOI after capital expenses. Capital expenses are not discretionary and must be paid. They are an intrinsic part of the cost of providing housing. As such, they should be included. The next item has to do with reporting of the tenant rent burdens. And we think this is a bit misleading. This is because the RGB excludes the value of rent subsidies paid on tenants' behalf. Two primary rent subsidy programs, of course, Section 8 and SCREE. RGB does not account for the fact, in assessing tenant rent burden, that a significant portion of tenants do not pay a major portion of their rent. Instead, the RGB's analyses project the opposite, that tenants pay the entire rent burden. It's simply not true, and we would ask the board to correct its reporting to reflect the burden actually shouldered by tenants. And it's helpful to take a look at the numbers. For Section 8, assuming 100,000 vouchers, go into some detail here, there are about $1 billion worth of tenant subsidy are real and occur every year. SCREE and DRE add about another $250 million in rent support. And the effect of this rent subsidy on rent burdens is not reported by the RGB. Now, why is this important? Well, the debate about the guideline often centers on the most vulnerable populations, as it should. But the board must reflect the reality that the most vulnerable are protected through assistance programs. And interestingly, those assistance programs, Section 8, SCREE, are much more effectively targeted than the guideline. The third instance of the analytical approach is that RGB reports prejudicial numbers by accounting for tax subsidies to owners, but ignoring rent subsidies to the tenants. Either both subsidies should be reported, or both subsidies should be ignored. Tax subsidies to owners, and again, here we're talking about 421A and J51, have the effect of lowering the apparent cost of operating a building. Reporting taxes in this way makes buildings appear more profitable. Rent subsidies to tenants lower their rent burden, as detailed above. By not reporting the rent subsidies, the tenant appeared to experience greater rent burden. So this inconsistent pattern of counting subsidies for one but not for the other is prejudicial to owners' valid concerns, and so this data should be corrected. Now, a second area of interest that I'd like to bring to your attention is what's been touched on here before, taxes and other payments to the city. And I think it's important to talk about, it's not just real estate taxes. I mean, taxes in the broadest construction of the term. In other words, everything that building owners pay to the city of New York. So the PIOC states that the tax burden is 26%. And by the way, I will say here, I'm going to use the PIOC number for this discussion, but we don't believe it to be correct. It's not our experience. It's not their experience. It's not their experience. I suspect it's not going to be anyone's experience here. But even without arguing the actual data, going with your number, when you take that 26% for the property tax, and you add to that the 5% for the water and sewer charges, and then you add to that, there's a whole list of other things that an owner is required to pay to the city. You can list them, which constitute, and you don't measure those, by the way, which constitute another 2%. This totals 33%. So of every dollar paid to run a building, 33% of it goes to the city of New York. I mean, the city of New York is a partner in these buildings, basically. So it's just to pay the city. So, and property taxes have increased every year by an average of 10.4% over the period from 97 to 2011. And those increases have continued since then at only slightly moderated rates. And I have a chart here. Many of you are new, so you've not seen this before. And Andrew, I'm going to ask you to make this part of the record. This chart here compares over I think it's a 12 or 13-year period, what happens to certain economic indicators and taxes, real estate taxes. So down here, gathered together, you have inflation, you have city economic output, and you have rents. They're here. Okay, and they're in a reasonably close relationship to each other. Real estate taxes, you will see over the same period go through the roof. And if the concern here, as it should be, as I hope it is to do something to preserve affordability, well, it would seem to me that the first thing to do is to attack this, because this is the prime contributor to the cost pressures in buildings. And we can demonstrate that further. If you were to take the period from 1968, which is when, you guys started keeping your records, through 2012, inflation increased, and I went to the Feds, the CPI, inflation increased by just about exactly 600% over that period. And rents increased by 677%, a little bit faster than inflation. It's entirely attributable to this, to the accelerating growth in taxes. So the point here being is that taxes are a primary driver of affordability pressure. And since the city itself is driving cost increases through taxes and mandates, which I haven't gotten into, but certainly both of those ways, the guidelines should be high enough to account for these actual costs. And as I say again, I don't think the PIAC has it right. The third broad point I'd make is about population growth and housing pressure. You're undoubtedly aware the latest data shows the city population at a record 8.5 million people. It's growing by 90,000 people a year. To house them, the city needs to add 35,000 new units of housing annually just to maintain the existing level of shortage. Okay? So if you can build 35,000 units a year, we'll still be where we are today. Right? And even the most ambitious plans, even the mayor's plan, does not even come close to this. So given that, it's useful about what we can do in this, or what you can do in this process to address this mismatch between supply and demand. And it would seem to me that that's actually at the core of the role of the board. And I would say to you that certainly scaring away investment with a very low guideline, which is not reflective of the actual cost increases, but diverting investment, that'll have the effect of diverting investment away from housing and affordable housing to other sectors of the economy. It's just going to be lost to the city. And it's certainly not going to be, the idea of strangling owners of existing units, by trying to withhold cost increases for bona fide costs is certainly not going to be a way to drive additional resources into housing. It just makes the problem worse. So accordingly, to sum up, I think each of us in the remaining organizations here are going to be recommending a guideline that we think is appropriate. And if you look at the long-term trend in the PIAC, if you look at what the core PIAC says, if you look at the long-term growth in the PIAC, and you take into account some of the problems in the data that I've reported here, we believe that the guideline should be 5% for a 1 year and 9% for a 2 year. So thank you for this opportunity. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Patrick. Any questions? Follow-up?
Sorry, are you going to share the chart if it's going to be
Yes, in fact, I'm going to walk up there and give it to Andrew right now.
And then, I couldn't read it from that far, but is that a pure increase in the real estate taxes, or did you account for abatements?
It's with the abatements included in.
Thank you.
So it's the actual tax burden actually paid by the industry.
Thank you.
I just have one quick question. Out of the 400...
So actually, if I just may, so I did what the RGB didn't do. So in other words, I took into account the subsidies, and so it's all done properly. Yes.
Sorry, just out of the 400,000 units in your membership, how many of those units are rent stabilized?
About 70% of them are rent stabilized. Yeah.
How many have preferential rents?
We don't collect that data, but the DHCR does.
And how many, if you don't have how many are preferential, how much people pay in the average rents for, for some of the buildings? you have people paying rents in this income bracket, in this bracket or in that bracket?
We know it very precisely. It's, just bear with me. It's $11.82 a unit. That comes from you guys. I mean, we don't have the kind of staff that you have access to and the city records that you have access to. So we actually rely on your data.
But it also feels like you seem to have a better relationship from owners to be able to get more data than maybe the city would, right?
I'm not sure. No, I'm not sure where you're going with that. I would certainly agree with the first part of your question, or your first part of your point, that we do have a better relationship with owners. We represent them, but we're not a data collecting agency. We will do reports from time to time. See, what our approach has always been, and I've mentioned this to Rachel and I mentioned it to her predecessors, is that you're the body that collects the data, and you're the body that's charged with that responsibility. And we would hope that as part of the responsibility that there is data collected, not in a prejudicial fashion, but in an objective fashion, which brings to light the sufficient information that would illuminate the arguments from all sides. That would be objective data. So, while I appreciate that you might be looking for a source of better data, we look to you, and we think that responsibility is incumbent on you.
Fair enough.
And then the other thing is about subsidies. So when you make the comment that some tenants are getting subsidized, it also, you are paying taxes, and then you're sort of getting those taxes back in the subsidies that you're receiving, right? And so...
Not quite.
Just to make the comment about affordability, and you mentioned that word, I think my definition of affordability is completely different from yours.
I don't think so.
I don't think so. Can I just finish the point? As far as it comes to burden on tenants, right? So somebody could be on SCREE and pay 80% of their income because in order to qualify for SCREE, you have to be burdened and you have to follow all the restrictions that they do. And so when the increases happen, and they might be paying $1,500 already in rent, which is a large proportion of their income for that rent, and then you get any increases from the city. So it's not like you're losing that cash, like somehow you're not getting that money. And so I just want to I feel like sometimes when we use that, we use it to benefit tenants, but at the end of the day is to make sure that you are whole and always continue to be whole depending on the increases of the rent guidelines board.
So I think you may have drawn a conclusion which wasn't in my statements. I mean, I didn't say what level I thought addressed affordability, and I doubt that our definitions would be different. But affordability is an issue that, look, I live here. I was born in this town. I was raised here. I've lived here most of my life. This is where I intend to make my home for the foreseeable future. I want to see this city succeed, and I don't want to see that this is a city that can't house its people. Right? I believe that as a New Yorker, and so I believe that we have to be collectively concerned about affordability. But I don't think that is served by an analytical method, which, I don't think it's intentional. I just think it wasn't thought about. But I don't think it's served by an analytical method that takes account of subsidies here but doesn't take account of subsidies there. In other words, we should simply try to get an accurate picture of here's what happens to me after subsidies, here's what happens to you after subsidies, and now let's look at where that leaves us. I think that'll create a much fairer picture.
Just to address part of that, I mean, every year when the new HVS data comes out, we readjust what they commonly put as the income to rent burn-in for tenants, and we take out Section 8, and we give that number to the board, and we make that number public. So we do consider that, and we do give that to the members of the board.
Well, let me just jump on this train here for a second, because I think it's an important point that Pat has raised in terms of equal treatment on the owner and tenant side. But let me just address, and I think Pat did a good job on the deficiencies of the income and expense statements. But on the tenant affordability side, and I know what Andrew is saying, you do take out the Section 8, but it is is just mystifying to me that both the city and the RGB don't treat this subject of tenant affordability accurately. It gets dramatized because it is reflected as a contract rent to income ratio. In fact, the HVS reports a category called out-of-pocket rent, which is what a tenant actually pays for rent each month, net of their subsidies, okay? And even the Community Service Society, which I believe testified here this morning in its reports, acknowledges that the rent-to-income ratios are overstated in the HVS, and they, in some of their reports, have made various adjustments, and it would be a very simple matter for the RGB staff, and we have provided this data from our own analyses.
Jack, let me stop you there, because we provide that data from the HVS every time we get it. We always provide that, without the Section 8, we always run the out-of-pocket one. So we give that to the board members. We don't have that data yet. We cannot run it until we get the data set. So we will run those, and we will give those to the board members.
I appreciate that. I think we still have a slight disagreement about how best that data should be represented. You can do it, there's a number of cuts you can do on that. We've done a number of cuts in past years. Those cuts of data have been verified by the RGB staff, and yes, we've moved the needle a little bit in reporting of that data. I don't think we've moved the needle enough.
So, Andrew, if I may, so you have some additional data forthcoming, is that what I understand you to say?
The 2014 HVS data set hasn't been released, so the only data that we have is the preliminary numbers that everybody's been given in the summary. So when we get those data sets, we'll traditionally run what we normally run, and out-of-pocket one is one that we run, and also the rent-to-income contract and gross, excluding the Section 8. So we will run those.
It might be reasonable to presume then that there might be some updated view of tenant rent burden. Is that correct?
We will run those numbers and we will produce them. Okay. I'm not going to comment on them until...
No, I'm not trying to box you in, but all I'm looking for is simply if there is going to be some updated data on this subject, we think it's very important. We'd welcome an opportunity to review it and discuss further that aspect of it. That's all.
Fair enough. I recognize that.
There's some data we know about tenant affordability. We know 23,000 New Yorkers got evicted last year. We know 11,000 of those 23,000, through your friend Steve Banks' data, was 11,000 came out of rent-regulated apartments. So we know that there are people who are living in the city, the data is clear, that can no longer afford where they live and are unfortunately adding to the homelessness roll, but 11% last year, up to 60,000 people. Substantially, a lot of these people are coming out of rent-stabilized apartments, and they're not being evicted because they could afford it but wanted to leave. They're being evicted because they can't afford to live there anymore and be adding to the homeless rolls of the city of New York.
But wouldn't the logical response to that be an appropriate and targeted expansion of the city's assistance programs? Because there is the SCREE one that we've mentioned already works so well, and why couldn't isn't that an appropriate response?
I think there's two things. One is I think we agree that there should be additional subsidies available. 43% of the people eligible for SCREE are not on it today because either they don't know how to get on it. Bobby Sackman from the Center for, I forget, Senior Services Center, I forget the exact name of the organization, continually talks about that data, that people who are eligible for programs don't get access to it. That's a problem we have in the city. People should be able to get those programs. We agree that we should find ways to make the city more affordable. And I think everyone around this table would agree to that. We don't have control over real estate taxes. We have control over setting the rent guidelines board increase. It doesn't mean that we don't support other things like, that Jack and Steve Banks can go to court together and try to keep a rent subsidy program. I think we all want rent subsidies programs. We'd all love to have more subsidies available. That's an Albany conversation that unfortunately maybe is getting marred down. But the reality is that we live in a city with limited control because Albany has the power to make decisions. If there are additional rent subsidies, I think everyone around the table would love that to happen. It'll help owners and it'll help tenants.
Yeah, maybe there's a further discussion to be had outside this context, but I think perhaps many of us may agree that that's one way to go. But you said one thing about the board's responsibility to set the guideline, and of course it is, but I think the responsibility has inherent in it the ability to divert investment away from the construction of new housing. And I think, the subsidies are great, but they're Band-Aids because they fix a symptom, they don't fix the underlying problem. And the underlying problem is that in a city that is growing the fastest of any that we've ever seen in our country, that needs many, many, many more units of housing than anywhere near the pipeline. And one of the reasons that investment is not coming in is because it's being diverted by this process. So you have that power as well.
Okay. To say that if investment's not coming into New York today, I don't know how investment could come in. Investment, we all live in this city, and we see we see the constructions going on, we see the investments coming into the city. But so I agree that we need to look at the data, we look at the price index, look at income expense, we look at net operating income, we look at all those factors, we look at tenants' income and expenses, and based on that data, we'll all make a decision we think is in the best interest of New York. That's our job, right?
Absolutely.
So we may look at the data and make different decisions, but all of us are using that to kind of figure out the future of New York we want, which is an economically and racially diverse city that has people who've lived here, be able to stay. I know that I have friends who are no longer living in the city because they couldn't afford to live in their rent-stabilized apartment anymore. I know them. And I know the people who are evicted from this city. I know owners. I have friends who are owners. So I have family who are owners. We all have to figure out the balance of this issue. It isn't one-sided. It isn't one data. And that's our job.
Okay. I'm going to take...
If I may, just one last point.
Mr. Sober to speak. Thank you.
I apologize, but there's one more statistic I'd like to throw out to you, and that's 700,000. 700,000 is our estimate of the number of housing units actually needed over the next 10 years to house New Yorkers. And, the mayor's plan is 200,000, of which really it's only 120,000. We hope that he's successful in building every one of them, but it's nowhere near enough. And so when you say, and a lot of people say, I see building all over the place, there's cranes, there's scaffolds, there's building. There really isn't, because what's happening is that the investment needed to build those 700,000 units is not here. And that investment is what you're looking for. That's what's needed, and it's not coming here. And the reason it's not coming here, there's a whole host of reasons, but this is one of them. Thank you
very much, Mr. Siconolfi. Okay.
I don't want to continue the conversation, but I guess I would just say I think it's helpful to be based as much as possible. And, we got a book filled with numbers here, which is much appreciated, to the extent that when you're talking about investments, other things, you can present data that shows changes in multifamily housing starts over time, money being put in. That's helpful, because otherwise for us, we're just hearing an assertion. We have no way to assess it.
Right, but just so you understand, the point I'm making is even if you knew that $4 billion or $5 billion, $10 billion was going into New York in construction of new housing, that's not the significant statistic. The significant statistic is if you need 700,000 units of housing, whatever that cost is not coming in. It's the missing money that is what you need. May I see the look on your face. Can we continue this offline?
Sure, but as kind of numbers are helpful to us. Is just my general point.
Thank you again.